confusion. So my badge says Stefan Szymanski USA, and if you can hear accents at all, then you'll know that it's not a very American accent that I have. So the explanation is that I'm an economist who's worked all my life on sports economics, and which is both professional and amateur sport. I have just recently moved jobs from London to the University of Michigan. And one of the reasons I think I'm here is because I was involved in a study for the European Commission looking at the funding of grassroots sports in Europe. And so my presentation is actually going to be really about Europe. And the topic that Mohan sent me was who pays for the party. So thinking about how the money flows actually work. So that gives you some background about what I'm going to talk about. So my first slide, I just wanted to So this is the answer to a question in the Eurobarometer survey, which is one of the best sources of data on participation in sport in Europe. Now, I should say firstly, my presentation is largely based on looking at a macroeconomic level. I've been attending lots of interesting presentations about micro-level schemes. But what here I'm looking at really is, as an economist, is the big picture across Europe. And this is the big picture about sports participation. And this is the answer to the question, how often do you exercise or play sport? I'm going to gloss over the issue about whether we're talking about sport or physical activity, which is obviously a very good question in its own right. But the answer to this question seems to, across Europe, seems to divide into three main areas. If you look at Scandinavia at the top, then there's a relatively small fraction of people who don't play sport, maybe 25%. If you look at Northern and Central Europe, you're looking at maybe 30 to 50% who don't play sport. And then when you're looking at Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, you're looking at 50% above who don't play sport. And one of the questions is, well, why is that? Why do we see these patterns of distribution across Europe? And I think one of the most, this is a table that might be quite difficult to read, but this was, again, from a Eurobarometer survey asking people why they didn't play sport. And I think the answers are very striking and interesting. The ones that people might often think about in terms of policy, in terms of the way that governments might be involved in physical activity and sport, would be absence of facilities or the price, the cost of participation. And what's striking about the table is that relatively few people cite those as reasons for not playing sport. So across the European Union, about 3%, 3.5% would say it was too expensive, or 3.5% would say they didn't play sport because of lack of facilities. The major reasons why people didn't play sport in Europe turned out to be they didn't have the time. That's maybe a third of people said they didn't have the time. And then about 1/5 said they just didn't like sport. So those are very striking reasons. And when we think about sports policy and how policy works, we should bear those reasons in mind. So, I want to say a few words in principle how we should think about sports funding in general, and think about how what the main economic issues are that you might have to address. And I would start off by saying, make a very simple, basic economic point, that sport is a normal good. And what an economist means by a normal good means that demand for sport increases with income. I'll show you some evidence on that in a minute, but it's fairly obvious that sport is, in general, is a kind of activity that people only tend to turn to once they've reached a certain minimum level of standard of living. and that's true whether you think about the historical development of sport. It's also true whether you think about rates of participation in sport across the world today in relation to income. Now, the interesting question, I think, then is what is the causal relationship here? Is it that just having a higher income causes you to have a higher demand? Is it something that is triggered by that income? So is it perhaps something to do with your increasing wealth itself makes you want to have more sport? Or is it that that actually the causation runs in the other direction? Is it that the more you participate in sport, then the more likely you are to have a high income? Is there some spin-off benefit from participating in sport? And we see, for example, evidence that more sport often leads to higher educational achievement, and that itself is a trigger for higher income. So does the causation run from that way? Or is there some underlying third factor which is controlling both income and participation in sport? So is it something to do with culture, history, background, or even genetics, which would drive both these activities? Those are fundamental questions which I don't think we have good answers on in general, but are important for understanding, again, policy, how you think sports policy should operate. There is a problem about the provision of sports facilities, and I would put it like this: the issue of actually providing the facilities for sport is a club goods problem. And again, club goods, in an economic sense, is related to the following issue. If you have a low income, then you're just not going to have any sports facilities because there's no funding to provide those facilities. There's no way to pay for them. If you have a very high income, you'll buy any facilities that you need for yourself. So if you're very rich, you'll build a swimming pool in your own back garden. But if you're on middle income, then like a lot of people, what you want to do is participate jointly in the provision of goods through a shared expenditure. And indeed, much of what policy might be about will be about enabling people to participate in the provision of club goods. So not about everybody having a swimming pool, but having swimming pools that everybody can share in and contribute to the cost of. Although you come back to the fundamental problem, what do you do about in the low income areas where there are the resources to pay for these things? So, and let's bear in mind some background economic trends here, that there's increasing economic inequality across most of the developed world. We see that as being a trend that has been going on now for several years. Time scarcity is a growing problem. So, we said that lots of people will say they don't play sport because they don't have the time. Well, that's a problem which is only growing. Then there's increasing public regulation of sports activities and increasing, so in terms of we think about things like volunteering, then the constraints of volunteering are limited to a significant extent by what volunteers are allowed to do or what qualifications they have to have in order to be volunteers. It used to be that you could just go along and volunteer in a sports club. Nowadays you have to be checked, you may have to sit exams and so forth, but that regulation limits the incentive to participate, and that may be a significant factor in generally the falling rates of volunteering, although again the time scarcity issue is likely to be part of that. So in the European context, the funding models for amateur sports come under the following headings generally. So subscriptions that people pay themselves, commercial income that sports organisations are able to generate, voluntary work, public subsidies from different levels of government and tax breaks and lottery income, sponsorship, commercial sponsorships and donor and gifts, and then solidarity payments again from, in the European context, professional sports organisations may give some money down to lower levels of the sport in order to promote activities. And this gives you a breakdown then at the EU level of where the money is coming from. I think the main lesson here is that most of the money is coming from the households themselves. So although if you think about, yes, there's a significant chunk there provided by local government, a relatively small amount by national government, sponsorship, media rights add a little bit, but over 2/3 of the money that is spent on sport So that in that sense, the funding model for sport in Europe is essentially a private funding model, even though perhaps that's not the way people often think about sport in Europe. They think about it as an activity that is funded by the state. That state funding is in fact overall quite limited. This gives you a picture of a breakdown by the different states and the different share. The blue again is the private funding, and again you can see the countries that are near the top: UK, Netherlands, Germany, Sweden, Italy, Denmark. You can see that Finland. You can see the private funding, particularly in the Northern European case, where again remember Northern Europe and Scandinavia, where you have relatively high participation rates. They're also the areas where you largely rely on private funding in one way or another. What's striking is that down the bottom of the list you see a lot of Eastern European countries where there's a lot of state funding, and you see those are also low participation areas. And indeed, one of the things is the households are choosing not to devote significant resources to sport, and that may well be an income effect that is. So that just gives you an idea of household expenditure per capita across Europe. And again, you can see that the wealthy countries are the ones that are participating at a high level in sports, and they have relatively high household expenditures upon sports participation. And again, the low expenditures are in countries where you tend to have relatively low participation rates. And that's, again, a chart just to show you the correlation between income, household income, and expenditures on sporting activities. So again, there's a very strong correlation there between household expenditures and GDP. Likewise, if you look at volunteering, again, the rates of volunteering tend to be higher in wealthier Northern European countries. Generally, although the pattern is less clear there, but again, you do tend to see the same kind of thing. Again, those where perhaps people have the wealth to be able to volunteer may well be part of the story. I'll just run through these relatively quickly now, but there's, in terms of the budgets, you can see that the pattern is less clear here. Is that where the sports ministry budgets may vary quite a lot, although again, the sports ministry budget in some of the high participation rate countries, like Germany and the UK, the sports ministry budget is relatively low. So there's less of a correlation between what the state is spending and participation rates than there is between household income and participation rates. Likewise, we can say the same thing about local authority funding. Again, some countries, of course, notably France, have a model based on very high levels of local authority funding, and has a higher participation rate as a Northern European country. And then other countries like the UK and the Netherlands have relatively low local authority funding, but still relatively high participation. Lotteries are interesting. I mean, it's just to say that in some countries lottery funding is quite significant. And of course, lottery funding is interesting because lottery funding is under pressure because of the deregulation of gambling in Europe and the limitations on the ability of states to divert funding from lotteries to sports activities and other so-called causes. So just briefly, to just give some conclusions to this, this is a very brief sort of overview of the situation, but from an economics point of view, just in macroeconomic terms, let's start off by saying that one of the issues about participation in sport is why a lot of people here worry about participation rates in sport. Why is it that we have relatively low participation rates in many areas? Because one simple answer is lots of people don't like sport. And I think it's as well to bear that in mind. We all, I'm sure everyone in this room does like sport or likes physical activity, but many people don't, and that's an issue about how you can most households fund their own sports activities. That's how it gets done, it's instructive, I think, given the belief that many people have in a kind of a socialized model in which the state provides funding. Actually, that's not really how it gets done in most cases. budgets are going to increasingly be under pressure in future years. I mentioned the pressure on lotteries as well. The volunteering is under pressure as well because of time scarcity, because of regulation. All of these factors are going to raise the cost of participating in sport in future years. It's going to become more expensive for people. So people have to devote more of their household budget to achieve the same kind of participation. Now, set against that, the evidence that the costs actually matter to people's choices is rather limited, and that's I think one of the underlying paradoxes here, that maybe the costs don't matter, but nonetheless, there is going to be pressure on budgets, and it is likely to become more expensive. Which seems to me the one thing that's interesting from a European perspective, and I'm saying this not just because I've moved to the home of the brave and the land of the free, but it's true that increasingly in Europe we're going to need to rely on philanthropic corporate giving as a way of funding sport, and that's an important question for policymakers. It's a very difficult way to raise funding. It's very hard to do, but I think in Europe we're going to be learning lessons. Perhaps some of the lessons that Shirley and Ken were telling us yesterday about the model in the United States and Canada. But also, obviously, because for many in Europe there are ideological people who don't like the idea of funding. And the question is, what are we trying to achieve? And will our ideology get in the way of achieving the things that we want in the sports area? So that's a relatively brief overview of some of the issues, some of the economic issues here. I don't claim to have any of the answers, but I think some of this data tells us some interesting stories about the constraints and the challenges that the sports sector and the physical activity as well is going to face